Hey everyone, it's Y again, and you're watching part 1 of a 4-part series
where I take a comprehensive look at the development builds of Halo Combat Evolved. This will be an in-depth look starting from the earliest builds that we have gameplay of up until the game's release. I'll be showing you a look into Bungie's process where Halo began its life as a next-generation myth-terrain engine, then a third-person action game, and finally a first-person shooter. The year is 1997, and Bungie's working on a modified version of the Myth engine. And although the gameplay you see here is not technically Halo, the engine being used here would go on to be used in Halo. What you're actually looking at is a third-person unit-controlling RTS. Bungie's initial plan for development was to create a real-time, sci-fi themed strategy game. Some of the gameplay elements that you see in this footage do make their way to Combat Evolved, such as the ragdoll effects that you see with the Marines. As Bungie continued to work on this project, they added things such as a more detailed terrain, vehicles, and buildings, like the bunker you see here. As the camera pans up, we see a number of vehicles available in this build. The first of which appears to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest version of the Warthog. At this stage of development, this vehicle is referred to as the Scout Car. The vehicle itself looks like a military jeep with a gun attached to the top of it. Bungie also got far enough in development of this build to add fire and smoke effects to the Jeep when it was destroyed. Moving on to an alien vehicle that looks sort of like a horseshoe crab, which was called the Alien Tank. Having alien vehicles in this build shows what direction Bungie was taking the sci-fi theme. And then when you look at the human vehicles, like the Jeep and the fighter jet, you can see some military themes as well. Now this next vehicle is rather small, but we got a good idea of what it is based off its name. It's called the Motzer, which is a very similar name to the Howitzer, which is an artillery gun, which leads me to believe that the Motzer itself is also an artillery gun. And for the last two vehicles we see in this version of the build, we see two human tanks. The first of which is called the Stalker, which has a camo pattern, and the other tank, which is tan colored, called the Zetsu. Now let's take a look at an updated version of that build. We can see that both a UI and minimap have been added. If we take a look at some of the elements of the UI, we can see Jones Trooper 092 and Last Man on the Hill. It looks like the first bit tells you the name of the character you selected, as well as what type of character they are, whereas the second part may be telling you the game type you're playing. That's just speculation though. Another RTS feature that shows up in this build is that selected units turn green. This is just a feature you'd find in an RTS that makes it easier to tell which units are selected. We see a lot more variety in both human and alien vehicles in this build. It looks like the top row is all human vehicles, while the bottom row is all alien, with the exception of the Jeep at the end. Let's take a closer look at these vehicles, starting with the human ones. Going from left to right, we see a Humvee, an assortment of tanks, and what appears to be an anti-aircraft missile vehicle. And then at the very end, we can see a jet fighter. And here's a better look at that jet fighter. Now let's take a look at the alien vehicles. Now I can't really name off each vehicle since they are alien, but we do know that the vehicle next to the Jeep is an early iteration of the Ghost. And if you focus on the vehicle next to the Ghost, it kinda does look like a Wraith, but I haven't found that confirmed anywhere. This build also has some more scenery pieces, with items such as gas tanks, and a garage that vehicles can park in. By the looks of it, the garage is holding 3 vehicles: the Jeep, a tank, and an unnamed alien vehicle. Now let's take a look at late 1997. Bungie had begun experimenting with different ways of controlling the units. Here we get to see some gameplay of some third-person over-the-shoulder point of view. At this point, it doesn't appear to have the shooting mechanics, so had it stayed this way, it would have turned out being a third-person unit-controlling RTS. So now that we know what's going on in this build, let's take a look at the different parts of it, starting with the HUD. We can see at the top right-hand corner, there's a mini-map with 3 different colored bars surrounding it. This design was made to intentionally look like the Marathon logo, which is another series that Bungie made. We also get a brief glimpse of some of the vehicles in this build, such as a human tank, another look at the Jeep as well, and also a vehicle we haven't seen before, a helicopter, which, if I'm not mistaken, has guns attached to the sides of it. And the reasoning for Bungie cutting this helicopter? They felt it wasn't futuristic enough to fit the setting they were going for. Looking ahead at the next build, which brings us to 1998, which you'll see has both shooting mechanics as well as driving mechanics, along with a redesigning of the player-controlled character. And just so you could see for yourself, here's a side-by-side comparison of both character models. Interestingly enough, characters hold their holstered weapon on their back, which is a feature that wouldn't make it into the Halo series until Halo 3. With the inclusion of shooting mechanics in this build, a green crosshair has been added to help players aim. The only weapon we see in action is a gun that shoots grenade-like projectiles that explode after bouncing. Judging by the look of things, it doesn't look like the projectile has any collision with the other character. We see two vehicles present in this gameplay, the first of which is a human tank, and the other, which we actually get to see driven, is a small dinghy boat. An interesting little side note about this vehicle is that one Bungie employee referred to it as two floating carrots. Being that the game is so early in development, it shouldn't come to a big surprise that the vehicle physics aren't quite right yet. Unfortunately for this next build, all we have are screenshots. I didn't come across any videos of this build in motion in my research. We see some more changes have been made to the player model between this build and the last build. The minimap also appears to have been updated, with both red and yellow lines added to it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find anything in my research that would indicate what these lines were used for. This build also gives us our first look at the Halo ring, and as you can see, it's partially destroyed, which could be an indication of what direction they were going to take the story. We also get a much better look at the weapons in this build, and judging by the low detail of the weapons, they probably weren't intended to be seen up close. Now let's take a look at the next build, this time with gameplay. This will be the last time we see the broken Halo ring in the development of this game. Looking at the character model, it appears that his armor is more glossy than in the previous build screenshots. If we take a look at the vehicles in this build, we get a much better look at the Jeep, which is now looking a lot more like a Warthog, while the tank on the other hand doesn't have much resemblance to the Scorpion. And this build also has a turretless Warthog as well. And then there's one more vehicle left in this build, and that's parked off in the distance. Surprisingly, it shares a lot of characteristics with the Elephant from Halo 3. They both are larger vehicles on tracks that have a mounted machine gun on top of them. The last thing I want to look at this build isn't a vehicle, but can be ridden like one, and that would be the Blind Wolf. The Blind Wolf was intended to be one of the creatures that inhabited the ring that you would come across during gameplay, and as I just mentioned, he can indeed be ridden, though the mounting animation is a little buggy. He may not move very fast, but one thing he can do is jump when needed. And that covers this build, but there's still one more build I want to take a look at for part 1 of the video series. This build would mark the last time that Bungie works on Halo before announcing it to the public at Macworld 99. From what I can tell, it doesn't look like the character model changed between this build and the last build we looked at. The color of the armor may look different, but that's likely just the lighting. We also get our first glimpse of what the early Elite design looked like. It's not the greatest angle, but we'll get a better look at them in the next build in part 2. The guns in this build appear to have much more visual detail than what we've seen in previous builds. Judging by the screenshots, this is probably an evolution of the gun we saw in an earlier build that shot grenades. Another weapon that can be found in this build is an anti-air rocket launcher. And as you can see here, it doesn't appear that the missile explodes when shot at the ground. There's also a few other weapons in this build that we get a very brief glimpse of as the player toggles through them. The back of this gun shows twin barrels, which most likely means it's the Spanker rocket launcher. It's also worth noting that the weapon on the player's back doesn't change as they cycle through the weapons. The other, smaller weapons are too hard to identify at this angle, so avoid making any guesses on those. The Warthog in this build has what appears to be a blue coloring to the side of it. When the player exits the Warthog, they phase right through the vehicle, which tells me it may be missing some collision physics. There's a segment in the gameplay where the player enters a structure, and as it turns out, this structure uses Bungie's early Forerunner design. In the book, The Art of Halo, Creating a Virtual World, Bungie's environmental artist, Paul Russell, was quoted in saying, "Forerunner architecture was created through a lot of trial and error back in Chicago. The original stuff was this insane hybrid of Louis B. Sullivan and Aztec." Some of the examples of the Aztec-inspired designs can be seen here as well as here. You can see the Sullivan inspiration through the arches and the auditorium-like openness. Not only do we get to see some early Forerunner designs, we actually get to see an early version of the control room. And although it doesn't look like the control room we get at the release of Combat Evolved, it does include the holographic Halo ring. And just to give you another view of this room, here's a screenshot taken from a different angle. And that'll do it for the first part of the series. Check out part 2, where I take a look at the 1999 Macworld build of this game. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.